So, chambers of the heart. We have two atrial chambers. They receive blood returning to the heart from the body, which is the right atrium, or the lungs in the left atrium. So we have blood coming in through the vena cava, so inferior vena cava, inferior to the heart, superior vena cava. So we have blood coming into the heart, into the right atrium. This is deoxygenated blood that needs to get oxygenated. Well, then it goes out through the ventricles. We'll get to that in the next slide. So this chamber here, this right atrium leads to the right ventricle. And then it goes into the lungs and comes back out into the heart, into the left atrium, which is now oxygenated because it just came back from the lungs where it exchanged carbon dioxide for oxygen. Now it's oxygenated, and it can end up going back into the left ventricle and then pumped out the aorta. Okay, so getting our colors straight here, the right atrium and the right ventricle are deoxygenated, and then the left atrium and the left ventricle are oxygenated. So we have our two atrial chambers, one deoxygenated, one oxygenated, and we have our two ventricular chambers, one deoxygenated and one oxygenated. The atrial chambers retrieve or receive blood coming in. Atrials receive the blood, and the ventricles pump the blood. So think of the ventricles as the actual mechanism to get the blood out of the heart. So the ventricles pump the blood out, either to the lungs or they pump it out to the rest of the body. Valves of the heart. These prevent blood flow from coming back. They are a one-way flow. So they are valves. Blood moves from the atria into the ventricles to be pumped out. That's through these valves. And so the first valve that the blood is going to encounter when it enters the heart is this tricuspid valve. It's also called an atrioventricular valve. So we have the left and the right atrioventricular valves corresponding to left and right atria. And so the left atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve is in this left atrium to ventricle. It opens up, allowing the blood to flow out, and then it flows out through this pulmonary or lung, right? Think when you hear pulmonary, think lung immediately. It flows out through this pulmonary semilunar valve. It's called a semilunar valve because it looks kind of like a moon going out. So it's a semilunar valve. It's also a one-way valve. It pushes the blood out pushes the blood to the lungs. Okay, so that's why I have it labeled blue. Tricuspid and pulmonary valves are deoxygenated still. The blood in these areas are deoxygenated. And then the mitral valve, this is also called the right atrioventricular valve. This one receives blood from the atria and goes to the ventricle, atrioventricular valve, right atrioventricular valve. So it's oxygenated, and then it pushes the blood out the aortic semilunar valve. It's aortic because it's going out the aorta of the heart. Aortic semilunar valve to go out to the rest of the body. So those are both oxygenated. They received blood from the lungs and are oxygenated. And so that's why they are both red. So work on these, get these straight. It's only going to get better. Blood vessels of the heart. You got your major veins and major arteries. For the major veins, we have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Obviously both deoxygenated, they're carrying the blood back to the body. And then we have the pulmonary veins. This is where it gets tricky. Your pulmonary veins are veins, so they're veins still going back to the heart. So all veins lead back to the heart. All arteries lead away from the heart. These veins are coming from the lungs back to the heart. That's why they're oxygenated. They're still going to the heart, but they're from the lungs, not the rest of the body. So that's why they're oxygenated. They're red. Your major arteries now, your pulmonary trunk. So this pulmonary trunk is pulmonary arteries. They split from the pulmonary trunk, and these arteries are leaving the heart, but they're going to the lungs. Pulmonary, lungs, arteries are going away from the heart, but they're deoxygenated because they're going to the lungs so that they can get oxygenated. All right, so get that straight. That's the only time the arteries and veins color is going to switch, is when it comes to the pulmonary circuit. And then we have the aorta, which is red, and all the blood leaving the heart goes out to the rest of the body from the aorta and is oxygenated at this point. So now we can trace our blood flow. We can start here with body tissues. All of that is deoxygenated, used up. So it's going to go into the heart from the superior and inferior vena cava, into the right atrium, into the right atrioventricular valve, also called the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, into the pulmonary semilunar valves, into the pulmonary trunk, splits to the pulmonary arteries, goes to the lungs. Bam! Now we're oxygenated. So now we're red. Pulmonary veins coming into the heart. So still going back to the heart, veins. Left atrium, bicuspid or left atrioventricular valve, left ventricle, aortic semilunar valves, aorta, supply the rest of the body with oxygen, and then we repeat. So the heart is just doing this over and over. So now that we understand the anatomy of the heart and the flow of blood, we can talk about what's going on with the heart physiologically. So it's made up of a couple different things. It has electrical activity or conduction that governs how it pumps. It has heart sounds. These are the valves. We'll break that down. Contractions of the myocardium, of the muscle cells of the cardiac, of the muscle cells. Sorry, my dog is itching really loudly. This contraction is called systole, and the relaxation of the ventricles is diastole. So this myocardium is in the ventricles, and so we'll break these down too. So cardiac muscle cells are mostly contractile, 99% of them are, and they respond to an action potential. And they are responsible for the actual pumping of the heart. Well, this action potential that makes them contract is generated from the pacemaker or autorhythmic, automatically causing the rhythm of the heart muscle cells, so pacemaker cells. When you have an artificial pacemaker put in your body, this is what they were trying to replicate because your heart is too weak to do it on its own, so you put one in. But in a normal heart, these are contracting weakly, but they initiate their own action potential. They're found in the SA node, the AV node, the bundle of His, bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers. And we'll break that down next. So normal cardiac rhythm is established by what's called the SA or sinoatrial node. It's this in the sinus of the atrial or the atrium. Okay, so it's kind of embedded in the superior portion of the right atrium. It's a specialized clump of myocardial conducting cells that basically is known as the pacemaker of the heart. It makes the atria contract. Okay, so the SA node initiates what's known as the sinus rhythm, or normal electrical pattern that's followed by the contraction of the heart. Once the SA node initiates depolarization or starts the contraction, it spreads through specialized internodal pathways to the atriomyocardial contractile cells and the atrioventricular node. So that's what these arrows are pointing. These are pathways to the atria and then to the AV node. This AV or atrioventricular node is the second clump of specialized myocardial conductive cells located in the inferior portion of the atria, the right atrium. Following stimulation by the SA node, this AV node then goes on to stimulate the atrioventricular bundle, also known as the bundle of His, kind of in the center part of the heart. And then this divides into two different branches. Okay, so that's these bundle branches. It divides into two branches. Okay, these bundle branches then make contact with Purkinje fibers. So you can see these branching Purkinje fibers. Okay, so these are in the apex of the heart. These Purkinje fibers then spread the impulse to the contractile cells of the ventricles. Okay, that's why these Purkinje fibers are last. They're kind of by the ventricles. They stimulate the contraction of the ventricles. And then that's where the blood is then pumped from the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk to go into the lungs, and then also from the left ventricle into the aorta. Okay? So these Purkinje fibers are the last step in the reaction. So it goes SA node, AV bundle, Purkinje fibers. Okay, you can also call the AV bundle the bundle of His. It goes either way. It's just based on its original founder. And so that's exactly what we kind of see here. You can kind of see the heart in a resting normal phase, cardiac diastole. So all the chambers are relaxed and the blood is flowing into the heart. Venous return. It's just in its in-between contraction phase. Blood is flowing into the atria. Well, now the atrial systole, atrial contraction, and ventricular diastole occurs. So the atria contracts and the ventricle relaxes, allowing the blood to flow into the ventricle. The atria contracts, forcing the blood out through the atrioventricular valve, right, the left one. And then atrial diastole, ventricular systole. So the atria then relaxes and the ventricle contracts. So then it pushes the blood out through either the pulmonary, actually both, through the pulmonary arteries away from the heart, and then also through the aorta away from the body. All right? So this is a nice little summary slide for you. And then the heart sounds. So what are you hearing? What physiologically are you hearing when your heart goes dum 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 dum? The first heart sound, the lub, lub dub, lub, that's when the atrioventricular valves and the surrounding fluid vibrations as the valves close at the beginning of the ventricular systole. So when the atria are relaxing and the ventricles are contracting, the AV valves open, right? And then the ventricle, it's this systole contraction pumping the blood out, this AV valve closing. So the fluid has already moved from the right atrium into the ventricle, and also the left atrium into the left ventricle. So the atriums, the fluid from the atria have moved into the ventricle, and that valve snaps shut. That's the lub. The second sound is the other valves closing, the semilunar valves closing at the beginning of ventricle or ventricular diastole. So after they're relaxing, so after they have already emitted beginning of ventricular systole, they're contracting, blood's coming out, the first set of valves close, and then the second set of valves after they've already contracted now close. So diastole, relaxation as the chamber fills with blood. So I know I was rather incoherent there, but the valves are what are making the heart sound. So when the first set of valves closes, you hear the first sound of the heart. When the second set of valves closes, you hear the second sound, the dup. And that's exactly what we can kind of visualize here. This is kind of an electrocardiogram, and you can see when the AV valves close, electrical noise occurs, so you hear the noise, and then the semilunar valves close, and then you hear a little blip again, and that's that second noise, that blip. Okay, so you're seeing pressure and then sounds correlated with these two different graphs. But what I'm trying to get by, this is a slide based off of that last slide, trying to illustrate the sounds of the heart with these valves closing. And that actually wraps up our blood and heart lecture. And after that, you can work on the lecture homework.